was. The next time she spoke, the world would tremble. There are moments in history where silence screams louder than rebellion. Isabella had lost her jewels, her land, her allies, and her voice. But there, in the cold ruins of what was once her power, something new began to form. A resolve, a shadow. By early 1325, Isabella of France was still Queen of England in name. But in reality, she had no court, no income, no authority. Even her personal jewels, those that belonged to her as part of her marriage dowry, had been seized by Hugh Despencer and King Edward II. She no longer presided over royal banquets. Her signature was no longer sought on charters. Her voice was no longer heard in council. And yet, her presence remained a threat. "The Queen does not need an army," one nobleman remarked, "only a single moment to undo a kingdom." That moment was coming. But not yet. In spring 1325, Isabella was effectively imprisoned in the Tower of London. Though no official charges were brought, she was not under chains, but she could not leave. She had no control over her attendants. She was not allowed private visitors. Her letters were censored. She lived in a gilded cage, guarded by men loyal not to the crown, but to Despencer. She passed the days in silence, staring across the gray Thames, watching ships go in and out of port. The world moved on without her. That year, her son, Prince Edward of Windsor, was sent on a ceremonial mission to France, representing his father in a dispute over Gascony. Isabella saw her son as her last hope, a link to future power, a boy she had raised with affection and quiet strength. But then came the final betrayal. Despencer and Edward II refused to let Isabella accompany him. The boy would travel with male guardians, under Despencer's direction, and if Isabella wished to see him again, she would need to beg for permission. She refused. Instead, she wept in her private chate. Pell then ordered every mirror in her chambers removed. "The face I see is no longer mine," she whispered to a servant. "It is the face of someone forgotten." But France had not forgotten her. Her brother, King Charles IV, had just taken the French throne, and he remembered his sister, the bride turned hostage, the once radiant girl traded to England for peace. From Paris, Charles sent a formal invitation. "Let our sister return and make her case to the crown." Edward II was furious. He ordered Isabella not to respond, but she did, secretly. In the late summer of 1325, under the cover of diplomacy, Isabella left England for the first time in nearly 2 decades. She claimed to go as a mediator in the Gascony conflict. But in truth, she went to reclaim herself. When Isabella landed at Boulogne, the people whispered as she passed, "Is that the Queen of England? She looks like a ghost." She wore simple black, no jewels, no guards, no entourage, but behind her eyes was iron. In Paris, she met her brother and the royal court. She kissed her homeland's soil, and she swore a private oath before the relics of Saint Denis. "I will not return to England until that serpent Despencer is destroyed." This was no longer diplomacy. This was exile and war. When Edward learned that Isabella had refused to return, he panicked. He demanded her extradition. Charles IV refused. He ordered the seizure of her remaining English lands. The tower rooms were emptied. Her servants back in England were dismissed or imprisoned, and then Edward made his greatest mistake. He sent a message to Isabella: "Return as my wife or remain as my enemy." She answered by sending back her royal seal. She was no longer his queen, not in body, not in loyalty, not in soul. Now, in open rebellion, Isabella knew she was a queen in exile and in danger. Assassins could be sent. Spies already followed her movements. Rumors spread that Edward wanted her arrested in France and brought home in chains. But Isabella had one thing now she had not before: sympathy. French nobles, English exiles, and powerful enemies of Despenser began to gather around her. One such man was Roger Mortimer, a former English baron who had fled prison and taken refuge in France. They met in secret, and what began as alliance became something more. Isabella and Roger Mortimer were opposites. She was royal, reserved, calculating. He was bold, rebellious, scarred by betrayal, and yet both had suffered at the hands of the same men, Edward and Despenser. Both had lost everything. Both had survived captivity. In their shared pain, something ignited, not just strategy, but passion. The chroniclers would later call it a scandal, but in that moment, it was strength. Together, they began to plan an invasion, an army, a return, and the destruction of the men who had tried to silence her. Isabella had no crown, no court, no army, but she had memory, she had rage, and now she had Mortimer. The queen who had once walked alone through torchlit halls now walked toward war, not as a victim, but as a shadow sharpened into steel. When a woman has been silenced, caged, and stripped of everything, she learns to listen, to watch, and when the time is right, to strike. In the courts of France, Queen Isabella shed the chains of shame and began forging a weapon more powerful than any sword: revenge. In late 1325, Isabella arrived in Paris under the pretense of brokering peace between England and France over Gascony. But the royal court knew she had not come simply as a diplomat. She had come as a wounded lioness, and they could smell the blood in her eyes. Her brother, King Charles IV of France, welcomed her warmly, seating her beside him at state functions. He paraded her as a wronged daughter of France, a queen mistreated by her foreign husband. And the French nobles were outraged. "This is how England treats its queens," one whispered. "Then England deserves to fall." Isabella's humiliation became her weapon. Behind velvet curtains and closed chapel doors, Isabella began meeting with English exiles, French allies, and secret envoys of discontented nobles. Among them was the most dangerous of them all, Roger Mortimer, the outlaw lord who had escaped the Tower of London and now lived in the shadows of the French court. They met in secrecy. No banners, no ceremony. At first, they spoke in cautious, clipped tones. Then, they plotted openly. They needed troops, French and mercenary, ships, coin, and most importantly, a reason to invade. That reason was already in Isabella's arms, her son, Prince Edward of Windsor. While Edward II had tried to bar Isabella from influence, the French court was beyond his reach, and in a brilliant move of political chess, Isabella demanded custody of her son, under the claim that he must swear homage to the French king on behalf of Gascony. Charles IV agreed, and so the young boy, barely 13, was sent to France. The moment he arrived, Isabella embraced him, and to the world it became clear. The heir to England now stands beside his mother, not his father. Back in England, news of the Queen and Prince together in France sent Edward II into a panic. He and Hugh Despencer feared a coup. Their spies in France confirmed the rumors. Isabella was not negotiating. She was assembling. Edward ordered her to return. She refused. Despencer threatened her with excommunication and seizure of lands. She responded by declaring publicly, "I shall return to England, not as a wife, but as a sword." The people of England began to whisper, "The she-wolf has grown fangs." Isabella and Mortimer now moved with intent. They traveled to Hainaut, a powerful region in modern-day Belgium, where they negotiated with Count William, offering political alliances and the future marriage of Prince Edward to the Count's daughter, Philippa. In return, Hainaut pledged soldiers, warships, gold. And so, the exiled queen, abandoned wife, disgraced woman, now had an army. She dressed not in silk, but in steel-trimmed leather. She spoke not as a queen, but as a general. "I come not for peace," she told her captains, "but for justice, and I shall have it." Back in England, the people were starving. Taxation had increased under Despencer's corrupt rule, landowners were imprisoned, and dissent was crushed. But hope now came in the form of smuggled letters and whispers in taverns. The Queen is returning. She is not alone. She brings fire. In secret, many English nobles pledged loyalty to her, sending messages to France with offers of support. Some even offered to open their castles when she arrived. Among them were Henry of Lancaster, younger brother of the executed Thomas of Lancaster, the de Bohun family, and remnants of the Marcher lords long oppressed by Despencer. In the early autumn of 1320s, Isabella's army boarded ships in the port of Dordrecht. Mortimer rode beside her in full armor. Her son, Prince Edward, now 13, wore a tabard bearing both the Royal Lion of England and the Fleur-de-Lis of France, a declaration of war and legitimacy in one. Chroniclers wrote that as the fleet left the harbor, the Queen did not look back. Her eyes were fixed only on the horizon. On the banners above her flagship were embroidered the words, "Pour la justice, non pour la vengeance." For justice, not for vengeance. But everyone knew they were one and the same. On September 24, 1326, Isabella's fleet landed at Orwell, Suffolk. No royal army met her. No resistance stood. Instead, peasants and nobles rushed to her side. Her army swelled overnight as towns surrendered to her, grateful to be free from Despencer's brutal grip. Even London's gates were closed to Edward and Despencer, the city rising in rebellion. Chroniclers wrote, "Not since William the Conqueror had England fallen to a queen, and never before by the hands of one so wronged. She had crossed seas with no crown, no treasury, no nation behind her. And yet, Isabella had returned. Not in chains, but in command. The Queen had raised her voice, and now all of England would hear it.